Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us at the Inter-American Dialogue today. We're very, very happy this morning to partner once again with the Inter-American Development Bank regarding the Caribbean. We did this a little over a year ago, and now it's a great pleasure to do so again, to launch a very important flagship publication of the Inter-American Development Bank, the Nurturing Institutions for a Resilient Caribbean. This is a part of our hemisphere that I think deserves a lot closer and more sustained attention and analysis, certainly here at the Dialogue. And we're very, very delighted to partner with the bank to try to shine a light on what's going on and what and the steps that we might take going forward for a more stable, sustainable, prosperous Caribbean. I want to give special thanks to Chris Barton here from the IDB for his collegiality and his collaboration, and also from the Dialogue side to Irene Stefania, who has worked very hard with Chris and his team to make this possible. This book is product of a lot of hard work and careful research. It's wide-ranging. It looks at a lot of different various countries in the Caribbean, and also with issues from natural disasters to rule of law, citizen security, fiscal institutions, and also the question of why the quality and strength of institutions in the Caribbean matter for the U.S., for U.S. interests, which we'll talk about in the discussion. We want to get all of you as engaged as possible in our discussion, so we'll leave ample time for your questions and comments. The plan is the following. We'll hear from opening remarks about the book from Therese Turner-Jones, an economist originally from Bahamas, who has come up from Jamaica for this meeting. She's a general manager of the Country Department of Caribbean Group and also the country director for Jamaica of the IDB. The main points and findings and takeaways from the book will be presented by Moises Schwartz, who's from the IDB and is the co-editor of this volume. He's a regional economic advisor and an economist with a doctorate from UCLA. After those presentations, to help kick off the discussion, we have two superb commentators with us today. Sally Yearwood, who is familiar to many of you, former executive director of the Caribbean and Central American Action. She has vast experience, a lot of expertise in the Caribbean, and she's been working on a variety of issues for many years. And she's going to share some thoughts on disaster preparedness, the administration of justice, and practical steps to help improve and strengthen the Caribbean's legal and fiscal institutions. And finally, Dan Erickson, who directs the Latin American division of Blue Star Strategies. He formerly worked at the State Department, the Office of the Vice President, and also at the Inter-American Dialogue a number of years ago, where he focused a lot of his work on the Caribbean and really did a lot to put the Caribbean on the map, at least from the Dialogue's perspective. So we miss him in that regard, but we're happy to bring him back for discussions on the Caribbean. He's going to talk about the U.S. government's range of relationships with the Caribbean and its institutions. So again, thank you all for coming, and without further ado, it's a pleasure to give the floor to Therese Turner-Jones for some opening remarks. Therese?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. I can't contain my excitement for today because Sally and I were discussing earlier, whenever I'm going to do a presentation, I have a hard time sleeping the night before because I'm always thinking, is there another data point I can use? What am I going to say? How is this going to come together? But what's really important for me today is how proud I am of the work of the Caribbean economist team under Moises's direction in the production of this book. And there are some collaborators here who I've known for a long time, including two that were on my interview panel when I worked for the IMF. So I have a lot of history associated with this. In case you missed the graphic out in the lobby, the picture is of the Parliament buildings in the Bahamas. You may not have noticed that, but I didn't have anything to do with that. But just to say that what we're going to share with you today is really important for the future of the region. There's been a lot of emphasis on what are the differences in long-term growth across countries around the world. This has been studied by economists and historians for a long time. And one of the big areas of focus has always been institutions, that institutions really matter. Why some countries grow faster than others. Let's look at what institutions can do for that. And I like the first quote of this book. And just to remind you, if you haven't been flipping through yet, the quote from Charles Darwin, 1845. So people have been thinking about this issue for a long time. If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin. I think this appeals to people in the Caribbean because not only are we quite religious in the region, but it also points to what I think are the basis of why we did this work in the first place. So the motivating factor for doing this very large compendium of issues and topics on the region is to figure out what are those aspects of our institutions that are working well and which ones are not, to do a deep dive, to do some benchmarking against OECD countries, countries of similar size. We refer to them as ROSE, which means rest of small economies around the world, and even looking at the countries in the region, separating the commodity producers, that's Trinidad, Suriname, and Guyana, versus the other three so the NC, they refer to in the book, the non-commodity producers, Jamaica, Bahamas, and Barbados. And there are some very distinct features that come out when you separate the two groups. Now, of course, for international comparators and for people who look at the region, we tend to lump the region as a whole. And so we don't make a distinction between commodity producers and non-commodity producers. And for the purpose of this study, we only focused on the 6 countries that are members of the IDB. So you would know that they are Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Jamaica, Bahamas, Barbados. So I got them all right, 6 countries. What's fascinating for me is sort of connecting the dots in the rule of law, our fiscal institutions, our judicial institutions, our health and social safety institutions, and politics. And I'm not going to get into any details, but I think what we have are some pretty illuminating ways of looking at the region and why we're facing the challenges we're facing. So a year ago, just over a year ago, I was in this space. We were launching another book, Restoring Paradise. And that one focused on the prevalence of violence and crime in the Caribbean. I'm very happy to see some of you have come back for this version, because I think what we have here now is a very broad, fuller picture of the institutional arrangements in the region. And almost when you start to connect the dots, for example, if you look at the percentage of the population that's receiving tertiary education, I was astounded that the Bahamas is the highest of the 6 country groups, and Jamaica is actually one of the ones at the bottom. In my mind, I would have put Jamaica on top and Bahamas somewhere in the middle. And that number, the Bahamas number, is close to the OECD number, but the Jamaican number is less than 20% of the population receiving tertiary level education. That has very significant impact for productivity growth in the future, because if, as we know, most of the world is really orbiting around exponential growth in technology, that portends very low outcomes for the future in Jamaica. So how can we leapfrog to figure that out and make sure that the graduates who are coming out of UE and other tertiary level institutions in Jamaica are equipped to do the things that we know they're going to need to do in the future? Another thing that struck me, teacher quality. And I'm not saying this because Cynthia is sitting in front of me and she's our educational specialist, but the fact that in the region, we don't have a standard way of assessing teacher quality. That's another sort of that needs fixing, because then we cannot think about improving the outcomes of students, whether they're coming out of primary, secondary, or tertiary level, unless we have a way of saying this is what the standard should look like, and how do we get our policymakers to focus on that. Under the rule of law, I think the news is pretty good. In fact, I was proud that in many cases, under the rule of law, we rank quite reasonably vis-a-vis OECD countries and others. But the other side of that is looking at public trust or trust in our politicians, and there we have the outcomes don't look so great. So there's a lot to chew on in this book. I like some of the takeaways of the authors at the end, which would focus our attention on what we need to do, but also the point about regional integration, which is something we did not touch upon in this book. And of course, anyone living in the Caribbean knows that most politicians are kind of obsessed with the idea of CARICOM, although there's very little action towards working together as a group. And I like the conclusion, which is, and this is something I've held on as an economist for a long time, we don't have enough trade among us, enough differentiated goods to make that a real objective. It's just a stupid objective. And I'm saying this on a live webcast because I think everybody needs to focus on that. It's not about trade within the region. What's important is how are we as a region interacting with the rest of the world? This is where the beef is, guys, not on whether, cement from Trinidad should be imported into Jamaica or anywhere else in the region. So another issue I think that emerges from putting all the information together is trying to figure out for the Caribbean what is our role, long-term role in the world, really. And does the paradigm that we currently operate under, and the way we've segmented the commodity producers from the non-commodity producers, the natural endowments that the countries have, because frankly, we don't have a lot of natural resources, but what does that say about the future, given the way the world is changing, right? And I mentioned leapfrogging earlier, because part of taking this region to another level is thinking about what we don't know, but also recognizing that what we don't know, we may need to know to get us to that level. So focusing on technology and perhaps thinking about a digital economy, which then unleashes a whole realm of possibilities, because we don't need natural resources for that. We don't need people to all be of the same type working on issues, because then the whole world is our platform if it's a digital environment we're working in. And we need to start thinking about some other models of development. And I'm very proud to say that 3 weeks ago, 6 countries in the region accompanied an IDB group, including myself, to Estonia to think about, is this one possible route for leapfrogging? So the whole idea behind that the whole of government is on a digital platform, and one need not go into a government office to do anything. Wouldn't that be great? Imagine not having to go to a tax office and having a tax form pre-populated, and you can pay your taxes from your living room. So, I think we have to think about other ways to improve the competitiveness of the region and look at areas where our institutions are really lacking. So the fact that they're not digital, the fact that the data isn't connected between government ministries, which give you the result on the doing business indicators. So there's plenty here. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this conversation. I want to thank Sally and Dan and Michael for this collaboration. This is a great place to have this kind of event. I'm also happy to see many friends and former IDB colleagues in the room. And I'm hoping that via the web live broadcast that we've reached a broader audience, and the work of this team will resonate with every person working and living in the Caribbean to see how we can make lives improve throughout the region. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's really a pleasure to engage in some dialogue about this, we hope, interesting book. First of all, thank you very much to Michael for hosting us, the commentators, and special thanks to Therese for all her support and leadership as we went along designing and considering what to do in this project, and certainly for all her support and advice. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is a combined effort from the whole Caribbean Country Department from the IDB. My co-editor, Dieter Bogerman, is also here, but all the team actually contributed, and it was, besides all the interesting facts that we have in the book, I guess it was a very nice exercise of collaborating all together and all being focused specifically on one issue in our daily activities. So all the team was basically working on this particular book at some moment in time. So that also was very important for the morale and teamwork for the group. When one produces such a book that it's full of recommendations and ideas for the future, so one comes to think, to say, well, what's going to happen next? Are people going to pay attention to this book or not? And what's kind of the shelf life for such a book? Actually, I'm very optimistic, and I believe that we have issues that should be discussed at least for 20 years. The region is diverse, and problems in one country are not necessarily present in another country, and there are so many issues that we touch upon that I certainly believe that if people pay attention to some of these recommendations, engage in dialogue with society, government authorities, and people in general, there is a lot to think about. And as we all know, institutions take sometimes a long time to evolve and to be amended. So I think hopefully this would serve the purpose of illuminating the dialogue in the years to come. I'll give you a very brief introduction to the book, just kind of a bird's eye view of what we have, simply to entice you and to stimulate you to take a look at the book more thoroughly. So it's impossible in 10-15 minutes to go into detail, so I'll just give you kind of some of the main findings. So why institutions and why this book? And Therese mentioned a little bit about this. Income gaps among group of countries have diverged significantly. Just to give you an example, 200 years ago, the income gap between high-income countries and low-income countries was 3 times. Nowadays, the income gap between advanced economies and low-income countries is close to 30 times. So economists have come with many explanations. Why are some countries growing faster than others? Why is development more prominent in some countries and not in others? And there are many explanations, and it's impossible really to come to a conclusion. Good luck, geography, natural endowments, perhaps, nobody really knows. But the branch of institutions in economics places a lot of emphasis on institutions as a main determinant of the difference in income growth among countries. So this is the approach we took, basically because institutions tend to shape incentives and frame the environment under which interactions among economic agents take place. So this is basically the focus of our analysis. The objective of the book is basically to provide some evidence, international evidence, on the effect of sound institutions on economic growth and prosperity and development, and how the fact of not having strong institutions leaves economies more vulnerable with less flexibility to face unanticipated shocks. So we review the literature, international literature for advanced economies, middle-sized economies, and we bring all of that specifically to these 6 countries in the Caribbean that constitute the Caribbean Country Department at the IDB. So we focus our analysis on the Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. And as I mentioned before, at the end of the book and sometimes in between chapters, we have some policy recommendations on the different aspects of the institutions that we cover. So that's basically the objective. not to keep you waiting, I'll give you some of the key findings. So Chris insisted that I need to go directly to some of the findings to keep you paying attention. So I'll just give you a very, a very brief view of some of the findings. In general, political and rule of law institutions in the Caribbean are in general appropriate. They have stable, open, participatory democracies. People trust these institutions. And actually, according to many observers and economists, political institutions are kind of a meta-institution. So once you have credibility in those institutions, the rest would follow relatively easier. So if you have trust in the political system, if you have trust in elections, the way elections are conducted and the results, and so on and so forth. So if you don't have other types of institutions, so you'll get there. But at least you have kind of the main important institution. And in that regard, the Caribbean is doing relatively well. For career development in the health sector and the educational sector, as Therese mentioned, it would be good to have some kind of a career development where workers in those sectors are monitored and evaluated. So it's common practice in other countries. This doesn't happen in the Caribbean, and that would really send the right incentives for the Caribbean to develop in those sectors. Regarding some institutions that have to do with economic activity, we basically focus on fiscal rule and fiscal frameworks. Those are basically absent in the Caribbean, and I'll get into that down the road. And central bank independence, it's basically not there, as well as transparency, not only for central banks, but in general, the way economic policy making in the region is done, it's not transparent. So some countries do publish some figures, sometimes with a huge lag, so it's difficult really to follow what's going on and to provide some certainty to economic agents. Another interesting element is the fact that some countries depend on a commodity, some countries do not depend on a commodity. For those countries that depend on a commodity, specifically Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and Guyana, the results in terms of transparency, public regardedness, perception of corruption, all those indicators that have to do with government turn out to be significantly lower than for those economies that do not depend on an economy. And this is a result that it's not only specific to the Caribbean. This is something that we have observed in other regions of the world. Once you have a commodity and you expect this commodity to be kind of the wealth of the people, your first reaction would be, well, these are going to be rich economies. And at the end of the day, it turns out that incentives to misconduct are higher, incentives for corruption are also higher. So particular institutions need to be put in place in order to address those concerns. So those are kind of the main findings, and as I mentioned, the situation in each of the countries that we explore is a little bit different, and the book has specific chapters on those specific institutions for particular economies. Now, just to give you a little bit of context in the region, for the last 60 years, the average growth has been for each of these 6 countries less than 1%. So it's an economy that is very slow, sluggish, basically not growing, and with a lot of volatility in that rate of growth. And the volatility basically stems from the fact, sometimes for commodity prices. So if you import a commodity and you rely on that commodity, so that's terrible for the economy. If you rely on the commodity for exports, so that's also an important factor. So if the price of the commodity increases, so the economy is booming. If the price of the commodity slows down, so the economy might enter a recession. So in a very brief overview, this is how one would characterize growth. The region is also faces a fiscal problem. Persistent fiscal deficit and a debt burden have been there for many, many years. Most of the countries in the region are above what one would call the 60% debt to GDP ratio, which according to some studies, once you surpass the level of 60% of debt to GDP, economy becomes a drag to the economy. So whatever resources you get from tax collection and so on, a significant share of those needs to be used in order to simply service the debt. And unfortunately, in the region, we have countries that are very much indebted. Some are moving in the right direction, like Jamaica, but still levels around 100% of GDP, even though those used to be 120 and a little bit more. Barbados, for the last couple of years, moving exactly in the opposite direction, reaching levels of close to 100% of debt to GDP. So even if you do everything right, you have such huge amount of debt that it's basically a trap that reduces your degrees of freedom to move forward. So maintaining fiscal soundness in the region is of the utmost importance. Briefly on living standards. So we have several indicators of education, health, poverty. The results are basically the same in terms of suggesting that there are relatively worse living conditions in the Caribbean than other regions in the world. A simple graph basically plots a huge amount of countries in the world, and we see the GDP per capita that these economies have, and an indicator of poverty, let's say. So for a specific level of GDP per capita, in comparison to the rest of the world, where many other countries are, the Caribbean performs relatively below what other countries are showing. And among the Caribbean nations, there are also very important differences. For example, Guyana and Jamaica have a similar GDP per capita in terms of purchasing power parity, Guyana and Jamaica, but the level of poverty in Guyana is significantly higher than Jamaica. Another interesting comparison, and the book has all these arguments hopefully well presented, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago have more or less the same level of poverty, but Trinidad and Tobago has a significantly higher GDP per capita. So for Trinidad and Tobago, according to the GDP per capita, they should be placed in a very different league where poverty should be significantly lower than what we have. So this is kind of just a snapshot of living conditions in the Caribbean. So in terms of institutions, we basically follow Douglas North's definition of institutions. Those are basically the rules of the game in a society. These are the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction, and that's why it's so important once you have strong institutions, so you provide certainty in terms of every single activity of economic policy making, and when you have weak institutions, so there is a lot of uncertainty how government and entrepreneurs and the private sector are going to react. We focus specifically on those institutions that the literature has suggested are relevant for growth and prosperity and less poverty. So we focus on, as I mentioned before, political institutions. Open political institutions is this meta institution that I mentioned at the beginning. We focus on property rights. If you have independent, fair, and timely judiciary, we focus on the development of career development in the health and educational sectors, and we focus on economic activity, specifically on fiscal frameworks and central banks. So these are kind of the institutions that we pay much attention to. Now, the Caribbean has a lot of history, as you know, and the institutions that one has at one particular moment in time have some history. So it's not that we develop those institutions. So there is some history, and it requires a clear, defined intent to amend institutions. So it's someone needs to do the job of trying to change an institution if you are not satisfied with institutions you have. But history has a lot to say, and particularly for the Caribbean. So in the book we have 2 chapters that deal specifically with history. I won't get into the detail of that, but there is an interesting element that the literature has emphasized on that regard, is that natural endowments, the colonization approaches, and ethnic diversity have a long-lasting impact on the institutions that countries face. And for the Caribbean, this is very, very marked. Just to give you a brief example and to stimulate you to take a look at those chapters, All the literature has taken a look at the difference between extractive and settler states. So the colonizers, so let's say the British, came to different countries many, many years ago, and they have different purposes. Did they come to settle themselves, establish themselves with their families, or they simply came to these countries with the purpose of extracting commodities and ship those back to England? So the type of institutions that were established, depending on the main reason and the behavior of the colonizers, explains a lot the type of institutions we have nowadays, not only in the Caribbean, but in different parts of the world. So if the colonizers decided to settle, so they were concerned about their own property rights, their own family, the education system for their own kids, and so on and so forth. If they simply considered the colony as an extraction, take whatever you have, ship it back to the mainland in Europe, so they didn't care about establishing some set of institutions. So nowadays, not only in the Caribbean, as I mentioned, but there is a lot of history in that. So this is an interesting element just to keep in mind, and there is a lot of debate about that, and I just thought that it's an interesting element to share with you this morning. Very briefly, so as I mentioned before, those economies that rely on a commodity and those economies that do not rely on a commodity behave significantly differently. So trust in politicians and public servants, diversion of public funds, all the way society in general feels about different indicators: transparency of government policy making, wastefulness of government spending, favoritism in decisions of government officials, the perception of irregular payments and bribes. Once you have a commodity, so all those indicators tend to score significantly below in comparison to the same indicators when you do not have the commodity. So this is what the literature has called the resource score. So instead of being a blessing, it turns out to be a problem for the future. So in that case, so countries need to pay significant attention to the way they develop these institutions. An interesting case comes to mind is Guyana these days. So oil extraction is going to be a huge development in the country. They should start extracting oil in 2020. Institutions are not ready yet. So there is a lot that needs to be done before 2020 to make sure that institutions are in place in order to handle the resources properly and the profits from those resources properly. Regarding property rights, the same story. Non-dependent commodity countries tend to score significantly higher than those that depend on commodities. Same is true for property rights, intellectual property protection, strength of investor protection, and so on and so forth. Regarding the justice system, as Therese mentioned at the beginning of our conversation this morning, so the results are pretty good and very close to what one would consider a gold standard. So we basically took the OECD countries as the advanced economies. So the closer you are to those indicators of the OECD, so the better. And in that regard, the justice system scores significantly high for Barbados, Bahamas, and Suriname. Corruption in the judiciary is perceived to be low. That's the case for Barbados, that has basically the same score as OECD countries. Justice administration could certainly improve regarding timeliness. So people trust the judiciary, but it takes a lot of time for the judiciary to finalize a case. So that's a problem, not only in the Caribbean, it happens in many areas of the world. The world average of number of judges per 100,000 population is 18. So 18 is the average per 100,000 of population. In the Caribbean, we have Jamaica with 3 judges per 100,000. Trinidad and Tobago has 7. So there is a long way to go in order to make the timeliness of the judiciary administration much more efficient. Regarding economic institutions, very briefly, and to leave some time for the discussion, we took a look at fiscal rules, medium-term fiscal frameworks, independent fiscal councils, and sovereign wealth funds. Basically, the region, we don't have any of that in the region, with the exception of Jamaica. So Jamaica has a fiscal rule, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, that they have a sovereign wealth fund. Suriname is in the process of establishing a sovereign wealth fund. Guyana, hopefully, is also in the process of establishing a sovereign wealth fund, and the Bahamas has just passed some legislation on a fiscal responsibility law. Other than that, we have nothing. And having transparency and having an institution that monitors fiscal implementation is key in order to provide certainty, in order to provide information, and for economic agents to have an idea where the government is going. So this is something that needs to move forward. Central bank independence and transparency is the same. In the early 1990s, basically most of Latin America moved in the direction of transparency in central banks, when it used to be exactly the opposite. It was considered a virtue to have some kind of vagueness, kind of, I wouldn't say darkness, but it was kind of it was perceived as the central bank had the upper advantage when they had some type of secrecy in their decisions. So the economic thinking has moved totally to the different direction. And while Latin America amended all its laws regarding central bank independence, the Caribbean was totally absent from the discussion, and it's still an issue that it's not there. And this is very important because nowadays, central banks in the region can finance the government, can be the seeds of an economic crisis, unfortunately, and governors or monetary authorities can simply be dismissed if the government, the executive, is not in agreement with what they are doing. So central bank independence and transparency is another element that needs to be fostered. To conclude, so there are so many issues that one can discuss, but I would simply emphasize that there is still a long way for the Caribbean. Some countries are moving in the right direction. It's up to the authorities and societies in general in every single of these economies to decide the best way to move forward. We hope that producing this book would stimulate some debate. Some might agree with the results. Some might say, you don't understand my country so well. So that's fine. That's the idea of a debate. And this is precisely what we intended to do, to generate some discussion based on rigorous analysis. So thank you again. Thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Moises. And again, it's nice to hear after a number of events in this room that there's high trust and perception of low corruption and so forth. That's not the case in many of the countries in the region, so that's nice to hear. Why don't we turn to Dan? Dan, you want to start us off maybe with some comments, and then we'll turn to Sally.
Sure, I'm happy to. And thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue for inviting me back. It's always an honor, and thank you to the colleagues from the IDB, and of course, my old friend Sally Yearwood for being here. Just to begin, I think it's clear that if the book demonstrates anything, it's the importance of the IDB as an institution in the Caribbean. And so I want to get that. So I think that the depth of the analysis, the care, the book I think is around 500 pages, and it really dives very deep into a number of countries. And Therese also kind of cleared up early on in the presentation a key question, which is which Caribbean are we talking about? Because one of the things that's always a challenge when you're analyzing the Caribbean is definitions. You've got the Caribbean community, which is primarily the English-speaking sovereign states. You obviously have a number of territories that aren't sovereign, such as Netherlands Antilles, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and then to some degree the outliers like Cuba or Haiti, which aren't necessarily included in analysis. And one of the things I really liked about this book is that it picked from the IDB's perspective, a very logical selection, the members, and then use that to really drill down. And the sample size of 6 is a good size because there's enough diversity among them that you can tease out lessons that are important for every type of Caribbean country, whether it's primarily a service economy or one that's based more on extractives. A couple of these Caribbean countries are actually in South America, in fact, in the case of Suriname and Guyana. And so insofar as the sample size is looked at, I think it's useful. Now, the book says very early on that there's a dream for the Caribbean in 2040 as a region with modern digital economies, thriving innovation, one that's climate smart and resilient, and where people are safe, productive, and happy. And the book says that that is achievable by 2040. And I hope so. However, I think if we went back through history and looked at different moments of the Caribbean's development, there have been a number of times when there's been looking into the future, a 20-year plan, where things didn't quite materialize as outlined. And so one thing that we know from historical experience is that trying to actually advance these reforms and this progress is extremely challenging on the ground. And that's due to the inherent vulnerability and fragility of these economies. It's due to the external environment, which is at best largely unfavorable and at worst pernicious when it comes to Caribbean development. And I think that looking forward, it's really important to keep the eye on the ball and make sure that we can advance this. The book does not. I'm supposed to talk about U.S. policy in the Caribbean, and I will. I did want to just address briefly how the U.S. is treated in the book, because the U.S. is not a large factor in the book, but it does come up in several of the country examples, and I thought it was kind of illuminating to look at that. At various points, the United States is described as a fellow country that's affected by climate change, hurricanes, and natural disasters, as an example of a colonized state which had been a settler colony as opposed to the extractive economies of several countries in the Caribbean, a setting where immigrants from the Caribbean can come and find an environment of greater social trust than may exist in their countries of origin. The United States is looked at as a beneficiary of migrant flows from the Caribbean, and at the same time as a potential threat to the Caribbean as far as talent flight from the region is concerned. In particular, the report cites one study from about a decade ago that said that there's over 21,000 English-speaking nurses from the Caribbean in the U.S., Canada, and UK, and only 7,800 in the Caribbean countries. And so you have a large number of people who are overseas. And then, of course, there's the old saying that when the U.S. sneezes, the Caribbean catches, depending on how you value the health, a cold, the flu, pneumonia, influenza. But the fact that the U.S. economy and the ups and downs of our own economy, and to some degree Canada and the European Union, very much affect Caribbean development as well. So while there's just a few glimpses of the U.S.-Caribbean relationship in the book, they point to several things which are undoubtedly true, which is that the United States economy is deeply interconnected with the Caribbean, that we share a neighborhood together, and therefore some neighborhood problems, such as climate change, but not necessarily all neighborhood problems. And some of the neighborhood problems, such as transnational crime, might actually be felt more deeply in the Caribbean than the United States. And then the flow of people from the United States to the Caribbean for purposes of tourism, for educational services, health services, and the flow of people from the Caribbean to the United States and to more developed countries. So looking forward, what role is there from the United States for institutional development in the Caribbean? I would just like to make a few observations. The first is the United States is obviously not alone in determining the Caribbean's broader external environment. I would actually note that here, probably on this very stage this afternoon, the Inter-American Dialogue is holding another panel on the role of China in infrastructure development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so you're seeing China play, I think, a much bigger role there than was envisioned 10 or 20 years ago. Also, there's a neighboring country from the Grand Caribbean in the form of Venezuela that has played a very active role through oil diplomacy and perhaps today through refugee flows throughout time. Next month is going to be the 20th anniversary of the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And so you have a generation of Caribbean economists and policymakers who've had to develop their careers and manage these problems now for 2 decades in terms of the changing role of Venezuela in the Caribbean. And then while the Inter-American Development Bank is talking about the Caribbean in 2040, the United States, because we tend to have a little bit of a shorter time frame, is looking at Caribbean 2020. And so that's the most recent strategy that has been rolled out by the United States government this year. And it was in response to a piece of congressional legislation, House Resolution 4939, the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act, which requested, it was an act passed by the U.S. Congress at the very end of the Obama administration, which requests the State Department and U.S. aid to develop a comprehensive plan and strategy towards the Caribbean, looking at 6 dimensions, which include security, diplomacy, prosperity, energy, education, and health. And the U.S. government has put forward one interim report on this. There will be another one forthcoming in 2020, which will be important. And I think that on the one hand, it's great the United States Congress has taken an interest, and that there's a more developed strategy towards the Caribbean. That being said, I mean, we have to be, I think, blunt about it. The U.S. has been missing opportunities in the Caribbean for the past 40 years. And, you know, I'm not going to go on too long and talk about every single one of them, but I think that there has been, you know, over time, particularly since the end of the Cold War and perhaps exacerbated even further since our own financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, of a general kind of withdrawal of U.S. interest from the Caribbean. And that was something, armed with all the knowledge I gained in Inter-American Dialogue, that I tried to fight against during my 7 years in the U.S. government, both at the State Department and then working at the last couple of years very closely with Vice President Biden, who was interested in the energy sector and held a number of high-level summits on energy in the Caribbean, which actually had some pretty impressive accomplishments at that time in terms of mobilizing OPIC, U.S. aid, other entities in the U.S. government to engage in the energy sector. But I fear has dropped off a little bit. Also, when you look at the institutional development in the Caribbean, I think that the role of the U.S., it's not the role of the United States to help build institutions in the Caribbean. That's really fundamentally, I believe, the role of the Caribbean governments and people themselves, you know, with support from multilateral institutions. Where I think the U.S. can play a more proactive role is helping the Caribbean defend itself from threats to their institutions. And those can include a number of things, including violence in the drug trade, corruption, which we didn't talk too much about, but which is a big issue. And then the talent flight. And, you know, these are fundamentally international, transnational economies. Families are spread out. There's a big diaspora abroad. And I think that if the U.S. has policies that allows smoother migration flows, easier repatriation of capital, and allows binational and transnational Caribbean individuals to contribute both to the United States and to their home economies in the Caribbean, then that could be very important. Now, just to conclude, I think that the U.S. midterm elections could potentially have a very important impact on U.S. policy towards the Caribbean in the last 2 years of the Trump administration. And the reason for this is that with the change of control in the House of Representatives from Republicans to Democrats, you're suddenly going to find friends of the Caribbean in very high places in the next 2 years. And they're going to have a lot more say over U.S. policy in the Caribbean than has been true, really since the Democrats lost control of the House in 2010. I won't go through everyone, but I'll name a few individuals worth thinking about, and probably individuals the Inter-American Development Bank should reach out to and brief on the contents of this report. One would be Elliot Engel of New York. He's currently the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's going to be the chairman, most likely, of the House Foreign Affairs Committee for the next 2 years. He was the primary author of the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act. He's a congressman from New York, and he's going to take, I think, a strong interest in this. I would also reference Nita Lowey, a congresswoman from New York, who is most likely to chair the House Appropriations Committee. And she has long experience in the foreign operations oversight on the Appropriations Committee. And as we all know from our studies of how a bill becomes a law, it's the House Appropriations Committee that writes the U.S. budget. And so while the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act was fundamentally a policy act that didn't come with funding attached, perhaps in a future budget put forward by the House, there could be a little more funding to put into some of these areas. Maxine Waters of California is going to chair the House Committee on Financial Services. That might be a nice office for Caribbean governments to talk to when they're looking at issues such as correspondent banking in the Caribbean and other challenges. And she has a long-standing interest in the region. And then lastly, in New Jersey, Frank Pallone, who hasn't necessarily had a long interest in the Caribbean, but he will be the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. And he has been a very strong voice on climate change and climate change adaptation, which is clearly a key concern of the Caribbean. And so I think that in certain very powerful offices in Congress, there's going to be a much more open door from the Caribbean to engage in some of these conversations and perhaps put a little bit of meat and weight behind a U.S. strategy for Caribbean engagement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. That was terrific. Let's go to Sally in your final comment. And Sally.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Michael, for the invitation. Therese, thank you to you and the IDB for the invitation. Dan, Moises, and everybody in the audience. I didn't want to acknowledge Ambassador Thelma Philip Brown of St. Kitts, who has joined us. I want to say hello to her. Thank you. And to everybody in the audience, thank you for joining us this morning. If Dan starts talking about U.S. policy, I'm going to start missing my previous job at CCAA because we are at a time now that's very interesting from the standpoint of U.S. engagement with the region. That being said, coming back to the book, as somebody who is not an academic but sits and kind of observes what's happening in the region, I found this book fascinating. So I urge everybody who's in the audience to read it and at least take a look at, even if it's just on a country basis, on the countries that you're interested in, go ahead and take a look because it's well worth diving into. And I think while I was going to be talking to disaster resilience, fiscal reform and rule of law, I want to talk about a few of the things that struck me as reading it, maybe as a way to kind of stimulate some of the dialogue that's going to be coming after this, some of the questions, because in a lot of ways the book kind of created a lot of questions for me. And one of the things that came to me when thinking about institutional resilience in the Caribbean is all those things that have gone into the small vagaries of history that have impacted the state of institutions in the region. And what this means is small things that we may not have thought about in the context of institutions have ended up having a significant impact on how the various countries have evolved. And as Moises mentioned earlier, one of the things that really kind of it laid bare for me was that structural weakness in a country's institutions can be difficult to overcome. And this provides a lot of concern for those countries where the stakes are high. From the book, Moises, you referenced this, Guyana is a prime example because they're facing I wanted to say onslaught, but that seems somehow kind of dreadful. But the oil industry that's going to be coming and creating a whole new set of opportunities. But is Guyana ready? And how do they get ready? Because one of the things that you talk about is the fact that it's very difficult to reverse. If a place has weak framework for institutions, it can be very difficult to reverse. And so if we are looking at an oil industry that's starting in 2 years or, whatever the time frame is, can Guyana turn the corner? The other example, and it isn't in the book, but I think it provides such a great kind of foil for everything that you're talking about, is Haiti. Because there we're looking at a place where institutions are almost non-existent. And what is that based on, and what are the lessons that can be learned from Haiti for the rest of the region? So one of the other things that came to me is the issue of trust versus understanding. Because you do talk about institutional trust. I was thinking about understanding the institutions in the context of which you're living. And I should say, for those of you who don't know me, I grew up in Barbados. So a lot of these things that resonate, they resonate because of the kind of the environment in which I was raised. But you talk in the book about the impact of trust, and rightly so. If people believe that institutions are acting in their interest, their relationship with the institution does remain strong. If the trust is removed, the relationship starts to break down, and it's a slippery slope into corruption on one side and into unrest on the other side. And so where I was thinking about the understanding was that if you think, again, going back to Haiti, if you think about people in Haiti today talk about the good old days of the Duvalier regime. Why is that? It's not because they trusted the regime, it's because they understood it. And so when you take that understanding of what the rules of the game expected and how that impacted your day-to-day life, how does that play into how you interact with the state in terms of the institutions that you have to work with? I also got to thinking about the historical context. And one of the things, without sounding kind of militaristic or whatever, the defining institutions in a society are generally set by the people who establish the rules at key points in history. And you mentioned colonialization and other kind of form, how history is impacted. But when those relationships change, and this could be anything from a colony becoming independent, a dictatorship becoming a democracy, a socialist system becoming capitalist system, or the other way around in any of those situations, it becomes this fundamental shift in a population's relationship with the state. And the expectation that that transition is going to be a smooth one is frankly naive. And so we can see how that is played out in various ways that people have tried to change, or kind of work development into a country when people have been used to one set of rules and all of a sudden it changes. Now, it's funny because this morning as I was kind of thinking about this, I remembered there was a Far Side cartoon from way back, and I used to have it on my wall, because it was kind of a foreign aid worker, or maybe CIA, I don't know. But he's down in kind of remote, I don't know, some place in remote Africa, and he's talking to this guy who's just standing there. He's going, the democracy is the greatest system in the world, and you need to do it, and we get everybody together, and then somebody calls him away, and he runs away going, don't forget, one man, one vote. And saying one man, one vote doesn't change the way people think about their government. So there has to be when you're thinking about how you're going to be interacting with the government when or a society when the rules of the game are changing, it cannot be simplistic. It has to be a lot more deeply held discussion about what is expected and getting the population's understanding to shift. Also brought up was the issue of CARICOM and regional integration. There's, as you mentioned, there isn't a lot of discussion about regional institutions, but it is worth making some comment about CARICOM, mainly because on the very first page of the book, and I mean before anything else starts, the very first quote is one from the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who says, "Institutions in the Caribbean have played a critical role in being able to enhance our democracy and to provide a platform for economic growth. It is vital that we work each day to ensure that our institutions continue to play this role without themselves becoming obsessively distracted with their own sustainability at the expense of achieving their core mission." And I thought, it is about CARICOM. But but it wasn't. But CARICOM is the epitome of a regional institution, and this discussion seems tailor-made for the CARICOM debate on the whole. And so I think people in CARICOM should take a very close, and by that I mean the institution, not the countries, should take a very close look at this book and how the lessons in it relate to what they're trying to do at the regional level. And this plays out again, recently, for those of you who follow what's going on in the region closely, but recently there was a vote in Antigua, Barbuda, and Grenada on the Caribbean Court of Justice, replacing the Privy Council as the final court of appeal. But they voted to keep the Privy Council, which is a holdover from colonialism, basically. And so it talks about, the issue of historical context, having resonance today, about how people are looking at their institutions and how they interact with them. So, to the question about paper, where do we go from here? So, how do we build stronger institutions in the Caribbean if one of the things that the book acknowledges is that a weak institutional framework can be difficult to overcome? So that's question number one. Second, how can we use the framework laid out by the book to make more informed decisions about how we approach development? Because development work has tried to make determinations about what assistance to the region should look like, but how much of the program's success is determined not only by the strength of institutions, but also by the relationship of people with those institutions. And then finally, and this is, I'm going to take 2 seconds and get to the kind of the disaster resilience areas, which, but one of the issues noted is the role of policy versus the role of institutions and where that breakdown happens. And the reason I left that until the end and just kind of touching on the issues of disaster resilience and rule of law and fiscal reform is that if we assume that the institutions themselves, if we've graded them as being strong or weak, where do the policy changes lie versus the institutional changes? So if we're talking about the transparency in the central bank, is it a policy decision that takes us to the institutional change, or is it institutional change that takes us to the change in policy? And I think that's an important question that we need to ask so that we know kind of what we're going to be moving towards. Therese talked some about the role of technology, which I think is going to be super important in the context of fiscal reform, because as we move forward, if the Caribbean is able to kind of adapt more and more technology that can bring them to a place where there's greater transparency and more trust, that will be extremely important in the context of institutions. And disaster resilience, I participated in a dinner last night, on where the blue economy was discussed. And the discussion went in a number of ways, and I'm going to talk about Barbados just for a second again, because the government of Barbados has made a distinct decision to focus on the role of the blue economy and how that affects the island's kind of relationship to managing disasters. And so, because it's actually a ministry now, it's a Ministry of Marine Management and the Blue Economy, or some Maritime Affairs and Blue Economy, thank you. And this is basically a first in the region. And so we now have an institution that may be able to guide the rest of the region about how they approach their management of the, of disaster resilience and the relationship with climate change. And also on disaster resilience, I did want to talk about, just very quickly, I think you mentioned in the book, is insurance and how the insurance institution, the institution of insurance, I'm not entirely sure, but how insurance and how people look at having confidence in the insurance sector to be able to react in the event of a disaster is an important question. And then, again, that gets to policy versus institution. So the line gets a bit blurred for me. On some of these. So that was kind of, I don't want to go on longer, but those are some of the questions that came to me and some of the thoughts that came to me as I read, and congratulations again on a great, great book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sally. That was great. We have only about 15, 20 minutes left, and we've had two great sets of comments. And so what I think would be most useful, given the expertise and interest in this room, is to open it up, and maybe Moises can jot down all of the questions and then answer the easy ones before time runs out. You might think about that, but and also give you the opportunity to respond to what you heard from Dan and Sally. Let me just start with one question, and then others, please. And you could also direct your questions to Sally or Dan as well, based on their comments. But Moises, was there anything that surprised you about what you found? In other words, you talked about the findings, but were these all things that basically you expected, or did something strike you as something that you thought it was different? And then just if you could talk a second about this, one thing that struck me listening to you was this kind of evaluation, lack of evaluation, I should say, in education and health, and sort of a lack of a career trajectory or path. You could just talk about why that's so. What are the obstacles to that you see in most countries? And if, policymakers are thinking about that, because that seems to be a real issue. So if you can maybe just talk about that a little bit more. We'll open it up now to other questions, comments. Yes, please. Just identify yourselves and try to be brief so we can get as many as we can.
Yes, good morning. My name is Alejandro Lara. I'm currently doing a doctorate degree in global education and dissertation concentrated in developing countries. I have very brief questions, very short. One is how the IDB and other institutions are aligned or involved, collaborating with CARICOM, which is Caribbean community countries, and its a strategic plan for the region, which expires next year in 2019. Second, any input on what to do with the problematic of the aging population in the region. And third, last week I attended the CAF meeting in Bogota, and the meeting was about productivity and innovation. So I want to see your views. How do you see this agenda apply into the Caribbean countries? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. David? Lewis?
Thank you. David Lewis with Manchester Trade here in Washington. Thanks to the dialogue and the IDB for this. It's been a while since people put out massive tomes like this one, and with the whole digital economy, everything's online. So I didn't read all the book, but I am a trained economist, and I've worked in the government and private sector in the region. So it's a pet peeve when I don't have to be making a living in the private sector. Just two quick points for the IDB. I understand the methodological limitation, but just so everybody is clearly aware, this study is about 6 countries that altogether don't add up to barely 40% of any basic economic indicator that we use in modern development. Population, growth, income, nothing. There is a whole slew of people, I'm not going to talk about countries, of people out there in the Caribbean that are not addressed by this from what is the primary development institution in the Caribbean, and probably the second in the hemisphere, depending on how the budgets are with the World Bank. So, and I understand why. I've worked with the IDB for many years, past century and so on, but that's a major, major problem. And on the methodology of the literature, there's various decades on institutions, but there's also various decades on leadership. Our problem is not institutions. As a matter of fact, I think we have too many institutions in the Caribbean. Public, private, civil society, all. It's our leadership problem, which is there. And there's a whole slew of that. And again, I also understand why the IDB can't go into the leadership, because the leadership are the owners of the IDB, the ministers and boards and so on. But, you know, I want to make it very clear, because these are two of the major challenges, facing for that. And I don't expect an answer from Moises or from Therese. I meet with Luis Alberto and I've met with past presidents. I don't expect an answer on it, but I think we all need to go in eyes wide open on that these are two very serious, real limitations in terms of what's going on. So I just wanted to, throw that out there. And I think it affects everything from otherwise an excellent piece of analysis from what's going on in many, in these countries right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. So we want to get.
Sorry, two quick questions. Good morning. My name is Rice Valdez. I work with Chemonics, focusing on rule of law in Dominican Republic. So the first piece, I'm kind of curious as to why none of the more Hispanic Caribbean countries were probably included as a comparison piece amongst its Caribbean peers, just to be able to see something a little bit different in terms of the 6 countries that were originally used, and what, if any, considerations, recommendations, and moving forward thoughts were given to how development assistance or international donors could play a role in strengthening these institutions in the Caribbean for either Caribbean 2020 or Caribbean 2040.
Great. Thank you. You have a question back there? Yeah. Please. We'll go back to Moises, I think, after.
Good morning. My name is June Aline, and I wanted to inquire with regard to institutions and information and access to information and information being public with regard to understanding where institutions actually are, and issues with regard to accountability and transparency, information and dissemination of information and open access to information.
Great, thank you. Why don't we turn it? You have a question? Okay. This will be the final question. Then we'll turn it back to Moises.
Yes, thank you. I'm Lisa Downs from Barbados, and I have 2 questions. I'll try to make them brief. I just had a thought about, you say you focused in the book about career development in the areas of health and education. And I wonder if any analysis was done about career development in emerging technologies, looking at the future of work. And, there's a lot of studies that have been done about the type of work that will be available in the future, and whether we are preparing our young persons for that type of work. So if any of that has been looked at. And also to touch on what a previous colleague here spoke to in terms of leadership versus strength of institutions. And I'm wondering and I've seen that where leadership and personality-driven type of administrations change the course of how a country is developed. But perhaps if we had solid, strong institutions that can withstand changes in administration, if that's not something to focus on. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Cindy, very brief, and then we'll go back to Moises.
Cynthia Hobbs from the IDB Education Specialist. So a few years back, I made a suggestion that we change the layout of a computer lab in new school construction for a school being financed by the IDB. And this outlandish suggestion created a huge debate within the ministry and escalated all the way to the minister. And when I went to visit the school, unfortunately, they had decided to use the old standard layout, even though my suggestion was based on international best practice and evidence that this could improve pedagogy, because it wasn't in the standards and guidelines of the ministry. And so my question with this talk about historical institutions is, how do you get to 2040 with a digital age and technology with institutions that are so entrenched in the rules and regulations that they can't make the changes that would be needed to get to where they want to go?
Thank you. Moises, you have more than enough, I think, to respond to. You can pick and choose. Just take about 10 minutes or so, and I think it's on. Yeah.
Is it on? Thank you, Michael, and I'll do exactly as you suggested. So I'll take the easy ones. Well, thank you very much for all the questions and the interest. There is a lot to talk about, and 10, 15 minutes of my responses certainly won't be enough. So I'll try to answer some of the questions. There was a question now about the country selection. It was basically the members of the IDB that constitute the Caribbean Country Department. So those are the 6 countries that constitute our department. So that was basically the emphasis of our analysis. Now, when we started, we had some drafts of some of the chapters, and some of the drafts initially had other countries, and the results in the Caribbean for other countries that were included in some of the chapters. And at the very end, we decided not to include those because it was not going to be homogenized for the whole book. But the results basically for the Caribbean were very similar to what we have in these 6 countries. There was a question regarding aging in the Caribbean and what's been done. So that's certainly an issue. We do not address that in the book, but a pension reform in the Caribbean is certainly necessary. People are aging, and as we have seen in other parts of the world, if the issue is not addressed, pensions become a huge fiscal burden in the future. So that's something that needs to be done. And actually, the IDB hosted less than a month ago with the Caribbean countries, with these 6 Caribbean countries, a seminar with pension regulators, how to start approaching these issues in the future. There was another question on the new technologies and the future of work. So we do not touch on that at all in the book. But the IDB is very much invested in all of this, and Therese mentioned some of the work in her initial remarks and the visit to Estonia. So the IDB is doing a lot, significant work on the new technologies and the digital economy and the future of work, skilled and unskilled workers, and how all of this is going to impact us. And there are a lot of interventions, not only in the Caribbean, but in the region, in Latin America in general, that have to do with that. So that's a very important issue to keep in mind. There was a comment on the leadership, and that the problem is the leadership, and you didn't want an answer, but I'll give you an answer. At least my answer is that institutions constrain leadership. So it's not that you have a leader and he does whatever he wants to. If you have an institution that is trusted, and this goes back to Sally's comment, if you have an institution, people understand how the institution functions, and people are facing the constraint that the institution imposes on them, so leadership is constrained. So you have checks and balances, and at the end of the day, institutions hopefully will do the job. So that's one way of constraining leadership, and to basically establishing the rules of engagement between the leadership and the rest of the society. Dan mentioned, well, many interesting points, and you mentioned the role of the U.S. government in the development of the Caribbean. So I certainly agree that at the end of the day, each country is responsible for its own future. What the U.S. can certainly help in the Caribbean and let the rest multilateral development institutions deal with. But one element is climate change, that I guess is extremely important, and another one would be financial institutions. So there is a lot of expertise here, all these correspondence banking and all of that. So those are, I would say, if I were to rank them, I would say climate change and financial institutions would be something that the Caribbean would certainly benefit from the U.S. to be involved in. Now, Sally had all these very interesting issues on trust and institutions, and if you don't trust institutions, so why on earth do you have an institution? So you are totally right, and actually I would say if you have trust and people understand the system, you might not even need institutions whatsoever. So let's take a look at central bank independence. There are very prominent central banks in the world that are not considered independent, but no one questions their independence. Because for hundreds of years, they have been doing the right thing, I would say. So people understand the system. So once you have an institution that constrains the way economic agents behave, and the institution is trusted, and the institution follows the rules of the game, so you enter kind of a virtuous cycle of understanding and the role of institutions. When you do not have any of that, I guess a first initial step is to set up the institutions and to try to build the trust on those institutions, and for those institutions actually to behave the way they are supposed to behave. And then, many years down the road, you might say, well, maybe I don't need an institution established in the way the Constitution says so. I'll give you the example of independence of central banks. Latin America realized in the early 1990s that many of the problems, the roots of many crises was, let's say, central banking financing the budget deficit. So they came with some regulations, amendments to the constitutions, new laws that put a limit to that, and that the governor of the central bank can decide with a board what to do, what's good for the economy, regardless of what the executive might say. Now, if you establish such an institution, and at the end of the day, no one follows the new rules of the game, so it's useless. But if you have the institution and you prove the strength of those institutions on a day-to-day basis, so I guess that's when you start having this virtue cycle. Now, you mentioned also the case of Guyana, if Guyana is going to be ready for 2020. Well, hopefully they will. So there is a lot of work to be done. They are in the process of developing a sovereign wealth fund. Many things have to change in Guyana to actually benefit significantly from the extraction of oil. The IDB is in the region. The IDB is taking part with government authorities, and hopefully the result would be a positive one. Michael asked me surprises when we did the job. So to be honest, I started traveling the region when I joined the IDB, and I realized that economic institutions were lagging behind. And that's a little bit kind of the rationale for us to engage in this study. So when we started, we had this idea of focusing on economic institutions. But then we decided to expand a little bit the coverage and go to political institutions, rule of law, because those are extremely important elements, and as I mentioned before, give some kind of support for economic institutions to evolve. So if I have to tell you whether I was surprised or not, I was very much surprised with the level of development of the political institutions, the trust in those institutions, and the rule of law for some of the countries. As I mentioned in my presentation, some of these countries score exactly the same as OECD countries. I wouldn't say there is any other country in Latin America, in the mainland, that would score that high. And I was extremely surprised. And it's a very good result, basically to say, well, if we have these positives, why cannot we have the negatives becoming positive? So that was something that surprised us in a very positive way. You also asked the question about career development for the health and education sector, and why is it important to have this evaluation of teachers?
Why isn't it happening?
Why
What are the obstacles to it happening?
Of course.
I know why it's important.
Yeah, you are totally
But it's
right.
not happening.
Well, my own understanding is that these sectors, and not only these sectors, are particularly resistant to change. And the way many of the teachers and the way many of the health providers, not only in the Caribbean, Latin America in general, the way they have attained those positions is not by competition. It's simply because of a union or a friend, politics, and so on and so forth, special interests. So once you have a position and then people tell you, well, you are going to be evaluated, where you are going to be checked whether you are a good teacher or not, whether you are a good health provider or not, so it becomes extremely resistant. And at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult to implement a law and to have huge sectors of the population to support it. Even though it makes a lot of sense, at the end of the day, well, people are going to be affected by such decisions, and it becomes very, very difficult to put them into place. So I've covered some. I avoided others, I have to admit.
Good. Well, Moises, that was terrific, and I think this has been a great discussion. Therese, by the way, didn't leave in protest to anything that was said. She had a board meeting that she had to rush to, so she sent her apologies and wanted to let everybody know that. But I think this has been a great discussion, and congratulations on a terrific volume. They make great Christmas presents, in case anybody is looking for Christmas presents for this book. But I want to thank Chris and Moises for the collaboration with the IDB, and hope it continues. We've had a session on the Caribbean now 2 years in a row, and we want to continue the focus. I think it's important. And really thank you to Sally and Dan Erickson so much for your great comments. And thanks to all of you for being with us and your great participation in this event. Thank you very much.